Hello everyone, in today's lesson I will cover the last three games on how to attack along the e-file. But before we start, I want to have a quick recap on what we have learned in our previous lessons, and also introduce to you guys some important new ideas. So first for the recap. 1. If you see that your opponent's king is uncastled, try to discourage or prevent them from castling. Then try to attack along the e-file. If certain factors are on the board, such as your opponent's king and queen, and your own rook on the same file, try to open up the e-file with forcing sacrifices, because such attacks will usually prove to be decisive. Okay, in today's lesson, we will discuss what Vukovic calls focal points. In games, often your opponent will have only one or two pieces guarding the critical e2 square, which defends the opponent's king. If you create e2 into a focal point and focus your calculations on deflecting and undermining the defense of this focal point, finding the right moves will become almost simple. Keeping these new ideas in mind, let's start with the first game played between Hansen and Lundin. Also note that in the book, only a diagram of the last few moves are given, so I felt that it would be helpful to see how the position arose in the diagrams. So I'll present to you the entire game. And as always, all the chessgames.com links will be given to you in the video description below. So let's start. The game started with e4, e5, f4, e takes f4, knight to f3. And this is known as the King's Knight Gambit, accepted. And then black plays an interesting line, d5, e takes d5, knight to f6, knight to c3, and this is known as the modern Scandinavian variation in the King's Gambit, accepted. And I think theorists say this is supposed to be an equal line for both black and white. So black continued, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, queen takes d5, and the opening moves are pretty accurate for both players, so I'm not going to go too much in depth. d4, bishop g4, bishop takes f4, knight c6, bishop e2, castle on, and then white plays the move c3. Now here I want to pause and talk to you a little bit about this position. Here white probably should have just castled on the king side and gotten his king to safety. Guarding this d-pawn was not immediately necessary. Here white put c3, right? So we first have to identify what the focal point is. So in this position, obviously, since we know that the topic is attack along the e-file, we can pinpoint that e2 is the focal point. So Lundin finds the correct move, queen e4. And this is a great move for a few reasons. One, it is very forcing because it attacks white bishop on f4. So white must either retreat this bishop or defend it. Second, it pins the light squared bishop to the king. And this truly makes e2 into a focal point. And in the game, unfortunately for white, white played the very dubious move queen d2. Okay, so I'm saying this is dubious, but now it is up to black to prove that this is dubious. So we have reached the diagram position in the book. Here, black has a decisive tactical shot against white's king. In this position, instead of asking you guys to pause your videos and try to solve it yourself, I will take this time to present to you my thoughts when I was calculating and how I found the correct move. And this way you will get an idea of how you can use the focal points we discussed earlier into your calculations. Once you master this, these tactical ideas in your own games will suddenly pop out at you. Okay, so when I first saw this position, I realized a few things. 1. The E2 focal point is only guarded by one piece, this queen. Secondly, the white knight on f3 is the only thing standing in the way of my bishop's attack on the focal point. With these things acknowledged, a plan becomes to materialize. I must somehow deflect both the white queen and the f3 knight. Of course, if I can successfully achieve this, I can force checkmate on e2. However, this task seems to be a very hard task to accomplish. How does one even begin to deflect both pieces? In these types of positions, where I have to deflect both pieces in order for our attack to work, I look at what squares and pieces both the queen and the knight are guarding. And if I quickly scan the board, it shows me that the d4 pawn, right here, is the only piece that both the queen and the knight are guarding. Therefore, after some careful calculation and taking into consideration some basic tactics, because the c3 pawn also guards d4, I easily found the move rook takes d4. And rook takes d4 is a truly wonderful move that highlights the power of utilizing focal points in your calculations. Note that the reason I mentioned some careful calculation was required was that I had to see that, of course, c takes d4 is not possible here because of the immediate bishop b4, and now the queen is being skewered to the king. So after rook takes d4, white played knight takes d4. So now, as you can see, the first deflection is successful. And after knight takes d4, c takes d4, and obviously once again queen cannot take on d4 because of this mate. So after c takes d4, we have the final move, bishop b4 check. So even though this knight isn't guarded by even though this bishop isn't guarded by a knight on c6 anymore, this move is very important because it is the final blow to this combination. This move threatens to deflect the white queen from its defensive duties of the focal point. Now the king is forced to move, or else mate is inevitable, because obviously if the queen is successfully deflected, then once again this is checkmate. So the rest of the game continued. King f2, bishop takes f2, bishop takes d2, sorry, and now the queen is gone. Bishop takes g4 check, f5, bishop takes d2, f takes g4, rook h to e1, queen takes d4 check, bishop e3, queen takes b2, king f1, and after black plays rook e8, and white resigned because white is going to be losing even more material. So this was a very instructive game, showing how important focal points are. Also realizing that in the diagram position, okay, so let's go back to the diagram position. so yeah, this is the diagram position. So I also had to realize that time and force were of the utmost importance. Something like rook to e8 is too slow because white can simply play king to f2 and consolidate his position successfully. Now, of course, I have no rook takes d4 tactic, and white should be able to work his way out of his bind and get a nice game. Of course, knight takes d4 is not forcing enough, because white can just respond with c takes d4, and the bishop b4 tactic is no longer working because the knight isn't on c6 to guard it anymore. So like knight takes d4, c takes d4, bishop b4, I can just take because the knight isn't deflected anymore, right? Okay, so now that you have a general idea of how you should logic your way through finding the correct moves to play using focal points, the next two games will be given to you as puzzles, so you can solve them yourself. So let's